Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I think we'll start our seminar now. I'm Angela Stent. I'm the director of the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies. And I would really like to welcome you to what I'm sure will be a very interesting discussion, taking it to the streets. We're very happy that Susan Glasser and Alexey Pivovarov have joined us. I will hand this over to Jill Doherty in a minute. I want to thank the Carnegie Corporation for supporting these series of seminars that Jill Doherty is doing. I'm sure that nearly all of you know who she is. She is a visiting professor at Ceres in Georgetown. She is a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and she, for many years, worked for CNN and was their chief correspondent, bureau chief in Moscow for a number of years. So we're delighted that you have put this on for us, Jill, and I'm going to hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Angela. Really appreciate it. And I'm glad everybody's back for yet another journalist boot camp on Russia. It is, when we were thinking of what we should talk about this time, I was struck by the, let's call it the odd symmetry between Russia and the United States. Because right now, you have both countries are embroiled in political ferment. In the United States, we've got a new administration, and right now we're glued to our TVs and the web looking at the impeachment process. Then Russia has, if you back up a little bit, it has the amendments to the Constitution that happened over the summer that allow President Putin theoretically to stay in office or return to office until 2036, when he is, if my math is correct, 84 years old. And then you also have these political protests that are taking place in both countries. Now, again, I'm not saying this is exactly the same phenomenon, but you do have political protests in the United States, the attack on the Capitol, Black Lives Matter movement over the summer, and then in Russia, protests that are ongoing just over the past couple of weeks in support of Alexei Navalny. And then you have each country accusing the other of interfering in domestic affairs. And yet, I ask myself, are these actually real parallels? Are there similar forces at work, or is this completely different? And I think the key questions here, do people, and in this case we've got two great journalists, do people in both countries really understand what is happening in the other country? Because what is happening and what we are seeing immediately right now could affect relations in the future. So that's kind of intellectually setting us up for this discussion. So introducing our guests, we have Susan Glasser. She is a staff writer, as everyone knows, at The New Yorker. She's been the top editor of, I think, every important Washington publication, Politico, Foreign Policy, and at the Washington Post, she was the editor-in-chief, the editor of Outlook and National News. And then going back to the period where I actually met you, Susan. In fact, you lived, I think it was 2 floors above me in Moscow, when you and your husband, also an esteemed journalist, Peter Baker, were the co-bureau chiefs for the Post. And they've also written together 2 fantastic books, Kremlin Rising and The Man Who Ran Washington. Then we have Alexey Pivovarov. Alexei and I have kind of known each other for a number of years, but I've really followed him. And he is a journalist who has done a lot of different things in journalism. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to hear him. He's been a media manager, TV and radio host, blogger. He was a news presenter and a correspondent for several programs on NTV, which was a network that I followed very closely in the early Putin days when it was basically taken over. And then we had, you were the manager at CTC Media Holdings. You went on to be a general producer on a Russian TV show. And then finally, and this is, I hope you can sneak in a few words about this, Alexei, you now, as of March of 2019, you are hosting the Redaktsiya, the editorial channel on YouTube. And I think it is crucial to point out how important YouTube has become in domestic media in Russia. It is extremely influential, especially among young people. So I hope maybe we could get a few questions about that. We've only got an hour, and there's a lot to discuss. We'll begin with the discussion for maybe about 30 minutes, and then we definitely want questions. Please begin to think about those. We want to get as many as possible, and we'll put those in the Q&A function. So if you start thinking right now, and Susan, let me begin with you. Just a few minutes ago, I was watching TV and watching what's happening right now. This is the impeachment process, but the replaying of those videos from all over the place during the attack on the Capitol. And then I was thinking how Russian media, which I follow very closely, have depicted those protests and attacks. And I would say that what they say is, their conclusion is America is in crisis, American democracy is in chaos, and the US has no right to tell any country, especially Russia, how to run its own country, how to run its government or its society. If you try to kind of look at it from both sides, is that a fair conclusion? What do you say?
Well, look, thank you so much, Jill. It's great to be with you and Angela and Alexei. Wonderful to have this conversation. And, I do think there's, clearly a real political ferment around the world right now, although I would be cautious about these sort of comparisons and equivalences. And if anything, look, this is right out of a playbook that long predates Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. There's a whole US term that we have these days, whataboutism, that really comes out of the Soviet playbook, frankly, for depicting and deflecting any criticism of the Soviet Union by pointing out the absolutely correct flaws and hypocrisies in American society as it stood in judgment. That in the 1960s, it was a staple of Soviet rhetoric to look at the racism in the American South, for example. Vladimir Putin has been saying long before there was this actual crisis in American democracy, and there is, to be clear, an actual crisis, it seems to me, in American democracy right now. Long before that, when you and I first met each other and lived in Moscow 20 years ago, and amazingly enough, it really was 20 years ago that Vladimir Putin first came to power. And it was already a staple of his political identity to look at the flaws and the hypocrisies in American democracy as a way of deflecting criticism about Russia. Now, in recent years, that's become, it seems to me, even more acute. What you've seen from Vladimir Putin is even a sort of a triumphalism as the internal contradictions and polarization and weaknesses, not just in the US democracy, but in Europe, for example. What you've seen is almost a triumphalist rhetoric in recent years from Putin. I'm thinking in particular of a really notable interview he gave to the then editor of the Financial Times a year and a half ago, in which he said essentially that the Western style liberalism is not just in crisis, but he said it's lost. And we've won, and we have a different model. So I would caution on the one hand about seeing anything new or particular in this kind of rhetoric. But the flip side is there is, in the last few years, it's been an extraordinary thing after being a foreign correspondent to be almost a foreign correspondent at home in Washington and to see, the unraveling and the attacks on many of what we perceive to be unshakable norms of American democracy. And that is the impeachment trial, the second impeachment trial of Donald Trump that we're looking at right now. It's about an attack on American democracy sponsored and inspired by the President of the United States in a way that none of us would have believed was possible just a few years ago.
Mm-hmm. Alexei, when you look at, let's say, your own views about what's happening in the United States, and don't worry, we will get into Navalny, but right now, has the Russian media, and I'm talking about state media, of course, primarily, has that coverage been correct or fair? Do they interpret what's going on in a correct way?
Hi everyone. I would like to apologize for the level of my English because as I told Jill, I have too little practice in recent years. But I will try to express myself as best as I could. Back to your question. It's worth mentioning that I quit Russian media and Russian television as a political correspondent or anchorman 8 years ago, so I'm not a part of this machine and can judge just as an outside expert. But what I can see here that Russian state-run media, primarily television, portray the events in the United States, and here I have to agree with Susan, as an internal crisis, as a consequence of the whole probably generations of American hypocrisy policies, and as a proof of the fact that America does not have any right to judge or to especially to teach Russia and especially Putin what to do in any circumstances, especially in turmoil circumstances we have right here, right now. And above mentioned thing known as whataboutism is quite known here in Russia as well. And this is the primary tool of Russian TV propaganda right now. When someone is trying to draw attention of the television audience to some flaws and to some pain spots in Russian society and Russian everyday life, the number one answer is that who are you to ask about that? Look at yourself and look at your own streets and go with your business. Don't touch us. And the fact is that the thing is that there are protests and there are these things unraveling happening in Washington is used as a proof that America is actually so unjust place that it just can't say anything, not to mention teach anyone what to do. That is quite unfair. That is quite unfair to be true. And this is the way to deflect attention from the real problems here in Russia. But that approach is so popular because it really works among many Russians, especially of an older age, people who do remember Soviet period and do remember this old Cold War and still have some probably bad feelings about the fact that the Cold War has been lost by Soviet Union. And that kind of approach probably is filled by some kind of revenge for them. You have your own crisis in America, and you have your own crisis because you've been so hypocritical and you have been so unjust for so many years to us that you get what you deserve. So this is the approach of Russian propaganda, but the keyword is propaganda.
But Alexei, in the old Soviet days, which I remember quite well, people would read between the lines. They would look at official propaganda and they would say, well, yeah, okay, but I don't believe it completely, or there is something that I can figure out for myself by reading between the lines. So does that still affect the way people look at the Russian state media, or do they actually accept what they are saying?
That's a very good question, but there is no simple answer for that. Because Russia is a split society right now on many levels, not only between pro-Putin people and anti-Putin people. That's on the top, and it's most obvious and more simpler, I would say. Russia is a split society in a generational level, because there are actually two Russias. One Russia is Russia of the TV viewers, let's put it like that. It's older people, 45, maybe 55 plus. And the other Russia is more modern, more young Russia, actually below 40, let's put it under this line. And actually the impact of the propaganda is totally different if we compare these two different Russias. That totally works for the first one and doesn't have any influence on the second one, actually, because the younger Russians in their masses does not watch political shows on TV at all, while more older Russians they watch it very carefully, and I think they do believe and truly believe what these guys are saying to them.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a very major split and very important split in Russia. So if you ask about the impact, you should specifically mention what Russia you mean here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good point. And Susan, of course, I mean, America is a split society as well, but kind of in a different way, obviously. But I want you to put your Russia hat on now and look at what is happening with Alexei Navalny and the protests. So, as we all know, I don't have to get into the history about Navalny, but he came back, was arrested, and then ensued a series of protests around Russia in a lot of different cities by people who supported him, but there are also other factors at play. But let's look at the way this is being interpreted in the United States. A lot of people are saying this delegitimizes Putin, or this weakens Putin, or undermines him. How do you look at that? Because I think you do have a perspective of understanding Russia and understanding the United States. Is the U.S. getting it right in that sense?
Well, look, first of all, when you talk about the U.S., right now it's a very inward-looking moment in the United States. And one thing that always holds true, because it's always an inward-looking moment to a certain extent in the United States, which is a big country that tends to be more absorbed with its own affairs than that of other nations. And often, in fact, that's the major mistake in terms of, the mistaken thinking that happens when discussing almost any foreign policy issue in the United States. I mean, I remember, being in Pakistan and Afghanistan after 9/11. That's a big issue, is that, Pakistanis would inevitably attribute motives to U.S. officials or to U.S. coverage of their country that really should be attributed to ignorance or indifference. When it comes to Russia, there's certainly plenty of ignorance, although less indifference than to other parts of the world. Certainly, Russia remains a very important part of the agenda, certainly in Washington. What I would say is that we have certain pre-existing narratives about Russia and Putin that have sort of played themselves out again and again. So Washington tends to get Russia wrong in very similar ways over and over again until it switches and it does something else wrong. One thing that's striking and notable is that there remain very few illusions about Vladimir Putin, but the constant question that I see in Washington that this Navalny wave of protests has sort of resurrected is the question of whether, is this finally it for Putin, right? We tend to look at things in terms of dramatic set pieces. Is this, a sort of all or nothing moment? Is this the moment that the hollowness of his regime will be exposed, or that he finally, and obviously that's not going to be the case. And so if it's set up as a kind of a black or white, either it's all heavy-handed Russian dictatorship, or, it's a kind of street revolution a la Ukraine or Georgia. that's where we tend to miss the mark in coverage of Russia. And I think that this coverage of protests coming after, by the way, months of street protests in Belarus, Russia and Belarus are so very different, but these all tend to sort of fit into a similar frame we have here in the US, which is sort of like, embattled authoritarian leader, and not recognizing that there's an incredible difference between what's happening in Minsk, say, and what's happening in Moscow. So I think that's one problem. The other, challenge is that there is a recognition that the Putin regime, after 20 plus years, is hollowed out, that there is a disaffection with the government that is genuine and that is reflected in so many people coming out to protest across the world. But remember, people have the illusion of political knowledge now about everything that's happening because we have real-time instantaneous access to what we think we can see. And so I was just really struck by seeing American journalists who don't know anything beyond what they have on Twitter about Russia. And they look at a protest where it's, negative 40 degrees in Siberia, and they see people coming out to protest, and they say, wow, this is incredible. The Putin regime is in big trouble because can you believe that people are so brave? And then they plug that into our pre-existing narrative about Donald Trump. And I think that's just very, very dangerous, but it speaks to the moment in a way that's very different than when you and I were first covering Russia, of course, when, the problem was not too much knowledge and the sense of transparency, but the exact opposite.
Good point. Alexei, let me ask you this, because there's another narrative, I think, in the United States, which is Alexei Navalny is academic Sakharov. He's like a Soviet dissident, brave man who gets out there, and eventually one day he's president of Russia when the regime collapses. This is all in quotes, of course. But is it really, are these protests really about Navalny? What is going on exactly?
Thank you for that question. And I would like to underline that Alexei Navalny, with all due respect for his bravery, and this was actually a unique thing that he made a decision to come back to Russia, knowing that he would be imprisoned pretty for sure. That's very uncommon in nowadays Russia, and we should actually respect this level of bravery, personal bravery. But that said, we should understand very well that Alexei Navalny is no Andrei Sakharov. His upbringing, his political, and I think personal background does not have any even distant reminiscence with academic Sakharov. Sakharov was an activist. He was a human rights fighter in the first place. Whereas Alexei Navalny is a politician, public politician. And actually the public policy is the thing which has been suppressed in Russia for 20 plus years from now. And such thing is so rare in nowadays Russia that Alexei Navalny choices and Alexei Navalny videos and Alexei Navalny whole deeds becomes so spotlighted, if I can use this word and if you can understand what I mean. But back to part two of your question. These protests has been trigged by Alexei Navalny for sure, but he's not the primary reason for that. And I can even assure you that many people who took the streets twice from the beginning of January and been incarcerated, imprisoned for that, many of them were not Navalny's fans or direct supporters. The thing is, we shouldn't confuse consequence and the reasons here. The reason why all these protests are taking place now is that younger generations, which are now 20, 25, 30 years old here in Russia, who actually grew up under Putin and has never seen any other ruler except for him, among them, the demand for a new for a new government, for a new ruler, is getting stronger and stronger with years. It's just a demand of something new and somebody new, because many, especially young Russians, are just tired of this situation, these politicians, this type of phraseology of everything. Here is, we just feel that demand for I would even use the word perestroika. If you remember the Gorbachev perestroika 30 years ago, there is a demand for something new here in Russia. At the same time, and that is why many people are actually willing and ready to take the streets to express this demand, this huge need for change. Russia needs change. Everybody understands that. And the thing which is which actually contradicts and which is actually going across that across that demand, and which is supported by state-run propaganda hugely, is a fear, especially in older generations, a fear of, as we call it here, of new 90s, because 1990s has been dramatic and very hard and harsh times for many people here, when people lost all their money, all their savings, all their goals in life. And for many people here, and especially in their 50s and 60s now, just to think that some kind of the same period can come back is a great fear and even a danger. And that is why they vote for Putin, not for himself. For example, my mother, she is not a Putin supporter anymore for many years, I would say, but she is afraid of new turmoil, of new 1990s. And that is a very important thing to understand about nowadays Russia. If you ask me, is Putin weakening because of this process, of these protests? He's obviously weakening with time, but not because of these protests, but because of this historical process, of which these protests are only a consequence and is just one of expressions. I'm sorry, it's quite a sophisticated thing, but I hope you can understand what I mean.
Totally understand. It's really very, very important, the points that you're making. You know, I want to remind our audience that feel free to put some questions in the Q&A function, and we'll go to those very soon. I just want to kind of go back to both of our guests for the kind of summation point or question of all of this, which is how could it affect relations between Russia and the United States? Because, for example, I mean, you could have more sanctions, you could have, build more missiles. There are a lot of things that could happen in response to the perception of what is happening to the other guy. So, Susan, let's start with you. Any predictions? I know it's early kind of in all of this, but any predictions where we might go with these interpretations?
Well, first of all, I think Alexei's making a very important point, which is that it's not, when you look at these protests, understanding what the other side is thinking, their analysis of it is very important, and that it's the fear is not so much of Putin at this point, but of the question of what might follow. And is there a meaningful opposition that can take power? What would come afterwards? And that in some ways has been a through line really for the last couple decades, is playing off of Russians' fear of not wanting to replicate this sort of catastrophic events that occurred during and after the fall of the Soviet Union in terms of the instability in the country. In Washington, I think that remains a big question. Is number one, there I think is a resolve that is clearly different. Donald Trump was not a supporter of whatever his administration's actual policy toward Russia was. And no matter how many times Republicans said, well, we have this very, very tough approach to Vladimir Putin, of course, we had a president who didn't agree with that. And so that's no longer the case. I do think that having spoken with very senior officials in the new Biden administration, it's clear that their resolution is to be much tougher minded when it comes to Russia. However, their ability to actually influence Putin's decision making remains limited. And we've seen in escalating rounds of sanctions through the Bush years, the Obama years, and even the Trump years, when Trump's personal inclinations notwithstanding, the Republicans in Congress joined with Democrats and made it clear they weren't going to pull back from those sanctions. What has it gotten them? Essentially, we've had 2 decades of policymakers in Washington talking about, using sanctions and other tools to, put Putin on the off ramp from this or that bad policy, and it hasn't happened. And so I think there is a more realistic understanding that there are limited options. I think it was interesting that basically Biden decided to extend the New START arms control treaty with Russia without even trying to have meaningful negotiations with Putin to see what concessions he could get. Essentially, he just stipulated on day one, let's go for the maximum 5-year extension. What else constructive can they do between them? I don't know. You've seen tough statements from the new administration when it comes to Alexei Navalny, but they have not so far followed that up with policy. Same thing, tough statements on the SolarWinds hacking that occurred last year, which the Trump administration essentially did nothing about because Trump once again undermined the conclusion of his own intelligence agencies. So far, the Biden folks have not done more. They promise that they will. They promise that they will work more in concert with European allies. I think on cyber is where you might see some more concerted action, some more effort to actually get Russians to pull back from the brink, perhaps with some combination of private threats and public words. But right now, I'm skeptical that the Biden administration will be able to meaningfully influence Putin in a way that its predecessors were not.
Mm-hmm. And Alexei, that kind of leads to you, and I do see some questions. I'm going to bring them in, maybe even in this question to you. Taking the Russian viewpoint, is there any prediction that you would have about how President Putin might react to what is going on, or his perception of, let's call it, the weakness of American democracy, how he might respond to that?
Well, that's actually sophisticated thing, but there is one point where I totally agree with Susan, that Russia and probably Putin himself has a pre-existing narrative about America, and this narrative tells him that America is a place, as a country, as a force that would indefinitely will try to interfere in Russian affairs, and will indefinitely try to overthrow him personally. I mean, him, Putin. And I don't think that actually that new administration can do with that can actually do something to change this course of thinking, because this narrative is so strong that whatever Mr. Biden or whoever it might be will do, that will be seen only as a proof that the US is trying to interfere. The US is trying to implement the colored revolution, like in Ukraine, and this is one of the I'll try to remember that nice word, scarecrow.
Yes.
Yeah, scarecrow, the thing you put on the field
Right.
to scare the crows. This is one of the main scarecrows for state propaganda. It's even have the name. It's called "Do you want here?" meaning in Russia, as in Ukraine. Because for years, Russian propaganda and Russian TV, they were saying for years that in Ukraine, they actually trade their independence for American friendship. And this is the worst thing ever you can ever think of. Sorry for my language.
No.
Right here, and for that reason, I don't think that there are any real instruments to change this course of thinking among Russian elite and probably in Putin's mind, because America, it's actually very convenient to see America, and not to see, but to present America for general public as a arch enemy, who is always trying to create some intrigues and so on against Russia. I don't think that these people amongst top Russian elite, probably besides so-called Siloviks, the top of FSB and other law enforcement agencies, I don't think that others truly believe that themselves. Probably not, but it's very convenient to present America in that way, because when the society is feeling the threat from the outside, it's much more easier to control it from the inside. So I think the stronger are the protests inside Russia, the worse will be relations between Moscow and Washington from Moscow's side.
Okay, and I do want to get to some questions. Here's one from Jed Wolfington. This is for Alexei. What do you think is the most effective approach for the US and the Biden administration to engage productively with the Russian Federation, Putin, in areas of disagreement?
Well, again, I don't have direct answer for that, because I truly don't know. I'm quite pessimistic here. I think, me personally, I think that as long as Putin hold power, the relations will be in a current, or maybe in a worse frozen situation. I don't see any chances to really make things better, because I can't believe that Mr. Biden will, go public and say, we've been wrong and we should be friends with Putin and he's a good guy. That would be greeted here in Moscow, but that's totally impossible from the other side.
Okay. Dr. Sten, would you like to jump in here with any comments, questions?
No, I think there's some other things in the chat. Why don't you, I would say, continue with those.
Okay,
There's a
sounds
question on
great.
the vaccines here, yeah.
Yeah, I think the vaccine is an interesting question. Let me just scroll down to it. Um, Yes. Paula Daniela Ganga says recent international media reports tell us that the Russian vaccine will be deployed in the developing world, but also in Eastern Europe and possibly in Western Europe. How will this change the domestic situation in Russia in the future? Will it change in any way? And I would add that the Russian vaccine, Sputnik vaccine, is actually a good example of soft power, and a good soft power for Russia, which doesn't happen a lot. So it's, and Susan, maybe I'll ask you, because the initial reaction to the vaccine was, this can never work. Russian medicine, it's never going to work. Russian science is terrible. And then all of a sudden we have the Lancet report saying, well, actually, it's quite effective. And I saw a quote from Putin this morning saying it's the most effective in the world. So how does this play?
I don't know if it's the most effective in the world, but I do think it's actually a really interesting story, because in fact, the initial coverage of the Russian vaccine was very skeptical in the West, and in the United States, there was a sense that they had not followed the kind of rigorous blind testing and the lengthy process designed to give confidence in vaccines that were being followed in the United States and other Western countries. And so you're right to see the vaccine now as a sort of soft power win for Russia. And interestingly, I think it hasn't gotten as much attention, but one of the things that Joe Biden did as soon as he became president was to not only rejoin the World Health Organization, which Donald Trump had withdrawn from sort of inexplicably at the beginning of the pandemic. It seemed to be as a way of somehow complaining that the whole pandemic was China's fault, and also somehow the WHO's fault. So Biden not only rejoined the WHO, but also announced that the US would participate in COVAX, the international vaccine distribution consortium being put together to make sure that adequate supplies of vaccine are being delivered, not just to wealthy countries, but to other countries around the world. I think the next phase of the coronavirus is going to be a much more international phase. Geopolitics are going to matter a lot more. And I think the Biden team is seeing this public health as an aspect of US foreign policy in this new administration. And that's going to be important, because you're going to see Putin exploiting the success of the vaccine. Obviously, the US has not just one, but multiple vaccines that have been developed here that ultimately can become a tool in its foreign policy as well as in its domestic policy. So, I think it's a reminder, the vaccine story, of how much Washington has often gotten Russia wrong in the last couple decades, that we've tended to, by seeing everything as all or nothing, right? That's a kind of zero-sum thinking more familiar to the Kremlin. And I think it's served the US poorly when we've said, well, either, Navalny topples Putin or the Kremlin is all powerful. Either Russia's falling apart. Remember, Barack Obama sort of gave this very dismissive answer often, Russia, it's a declining third-rate power. Well, that turned out to be not a very successful way to negotiate with the Kremlin. And I think this is an example of that. We've tended in some ways to count Russia out more than it has been. And I see the vaccine story as part of that.
Mm-hmm. Alexei, do you want to jump in on that briefly? Because we do have a couple of questions about Belarus that I'd like to get into. But anything on the vaccine?
Yeah, I can only agree that Russia is a sophisticated place. The vaccine is obviously works. And Putin obviously is trying to put it at his own help me with this word, Jill.
What?
He's trying to exploit the success of the vaccine in his political agenda. That's actually doesn't have anything to do with Navalny or with the protests.
Mhm. Now, on Belarus, there are a couple of questions, and I'll try to kind of blend them together. There's one from Jessica Meyerson, who says, what parallels can you draw between the protests in Russia and the protests in Belarus? Do you think that the Biden administration will prioritize the internal affairs of Russia and or Belarus in its foreign policy? And I would just kind of broaden that because that's actually one thing I was thinking about. Domestic affairs are playing a very big role in each country. You know, Russia has parliamentary elections. Domestic issues, as Susan pointed out, are very important here. But do you think that the Biden administration, if you can jump into this, Susan, maybe you're the person here, will begin to, if not prioritize and pay more attention to domestic issues, especially in Russia and Belarus and maybe Ukraine?
So first of all, we are seeing a return to what I would call the status quo ante of American foreign policy making when it comes at least to sort of doing and saying the right things, the expected things. You know, you've had a blizzard of statements as developments have warranted, in particular on human rights issues and protest type issues. From the new National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, from the new Secretary of State, Tony Blinken. These are folks who are putting America back on the map simply by sort of doing and saying the things you expect America to be doing and saying. However, again, when you look at what is the actual ability of the United States to influence events in Minsk or in Moscow, that's where I think it becomes a little bit less clear how sharp of a break in terms of policy there will be. Certainly, they've been much more vocal about human rights abuses. I expect that to continue to be the case. And by the way, not just in regards to Russia and Eastern Europe, you're seeing that in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia. I think you're seeing that in Asia. Very quick response on Myanmar that I don't think we would have seen from the Trump administration. You know, this is where I think we're going to have the first real test of what it means when Biden says we're going to work with our allies again in Europe. Because if there's one thing that a renewed and more effective alliance with Europeans would do, it would be to have a better policy and more success in its dealings with Europe's neighbors in Belarus and in Russia. So, you know, once again, what can come out of a meaningful alliance with Germany again? So we have the president not attacking Angela Merkel, but working with her. Well, okay, so what are they going to do? I don't have answers for you on that, but I would say that Minsk ought to be the test case of this, and Moscow ought to be the test case of this.
Which leads into a question from one of our viewers, Daniel Breslow. Can we, and this is, Alexei, I think this would be for you, can we expect the Navalny protest to affect Putin's stance on Lukashenko negotiating with the Belarusian opposition? Because obviously both leaders are taking lessons from each other. So do you think that will have an effect? Like the way Lukashenko is dealing with the protests, would that influence how Putin is dealing with the protests?
Well, yes, probably, but it's a very important thing I have to stress your attention to when it comes to Belarus and Belarusian and Russian protests. That I'm totally sure that Putin and his people seeing these protests as a process sponsored by America, as well as in Ukraine several years ago. They don't think that people are taking streets by themselves. They're pretty sure that is some kind of full play or spy game is in place from America's side. And the stronger is the protests, the more they believe it. And we see that if you hear Lukashenko's rhetoric, he's always referring to evil West and specifically to the United States as a force behind these protests. And today he actually made very interesting speech in which he looks like he begins to trade his abolition of power, his retirement, for personal guarantees and for no protests. And when he's saying no protests, I'm absolutely sure he is addressing not his own people, but the United States. And the same thing is about Putin. It's weird, but this is how these people see the situation. And this is the consequence. It's absolutely, it's very weird. It's very perversive to see the modern world in that way. But this is the consequence of being in power for more than 20 years, I believe.
You know, in the beginning, we were talking about sanctions, and I just want to drill down because this is what the United States at this point seems to take off the shelf every time something happens with Russia. You introduce another sanction. Susan, is there any thinking now in this administration, or from what you understand on Capitol Hill, about perhaps reevaluating that? It seems almost like a knee-jerk reaction without too much benefit.
You know, Jill, this has been very much on my mind, you know, as we have had a new administration come in, you know, saying a lot of things about Russia, but not necessarily having the wherewithal to do a lot of different things. And I've asked this question to a number of senior interlocutors, and I think they're still casting about. Again, I would look to cyber, which is obviously an emerging field of active contest and dispute between Russia and the United States. It's one where I think U.S. officials feel they might have more ability than with China to actually perhaps you know, use the example of the Cold War and the example of why both nation states have a lot at risk in this emerging cyber competition. So that's one area that might take them outside of this tit for tat cycle of sanctions, where there to be an actual dialogue. I'm still skeptical on that. You then also have the question of what kind of post-Trump military presence and force will you see coming from NATO in this post-Trump world. And so that's an interesting question too, because in fact, the willingness of the United States and European partners to move troops around Europe and to position a kind of European stabilization force in places like Poland and the Baltics was one example, aside from sanctions, where you saw a stepped up response to Russian aggression and takeover of the Crimea. So, you know, that's another area I would spotlight. There continue to be the sort of hot and heavy politics of the Nord Stream pipeline, and in general, the oil and energy politics. I don't, at the moment, see anything that suggests to me that Germany is going to be more willing now than it was 2 years ago to use Nord Stream as a bargaining chip with the Russians, and so that gets us right back to sanctions and sanctions again. I think it's a world where kind of uncomfortable standoff and impasse seems more to have become the new norm.
You know,
Jill, could I just add something to that? Sorry. No, I agree with everything that Susan has said. I just want to remind everyone that, you know, when Trump first came into office, right, the US Congress took away from the president the ability to impose and lift sanctions by executive order, which is what President Obama had used. So all of the sanctions that we now have are enshrined in congressional law, and they're very, very difficult to remove, nor do most of them have any provisions in them that would in fact reward better behavior. Now, having said that, my understanding is that the Biden administration is going to review, as part of the entire review that they're doing of Russia policy and what happened in the last 4 years, that they're going to review the sanctions. That doesn't necessarily mean they're going to lift them, but they're going to see how effective they've been. But that will certainly take time. I would remind also our participants that there are very few people yet in place in the administration who are actually tasked with focusing on Russia. Obviously, we have a Secretary of State, we have a National Security Advisor, etc. But some of the key people are not there yet. So that, I think, certainly would take some time. And the final thing I would say is on the cyber, of course, they're going to have to figure out how they respond to the SolarWinds attack and other things. But there is also this proposal from President Putin, and there have been Russian proposals on this for a few years now, about why don't we sit down and talk about rules of the road in cyber. Now, that has tended to be dismissed, obviously, in this town, but there's some people who are arguing maybe we should at least see what it is that Russia is proposing and see if there's anything to be gained by having such a discussion. So I think we're in the early stages there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, we are very close to the end. Maybe I'll give the last word to Alexei, because you're farther away and it's a rare opportunity to talk with somebody directly. Let me ask you this, and it's kind of flowing from what both Dr. Stent and Susan are talking about. Put yourself in the position of President Putin. He's looking at all of this, protests, etc. Does he think he has things under control? Or is he so focused on the domestic situation that he might be less focused on the international? I mean, maybe that is a crazy question, but could he be so deflected by the domestic situation that we could have a quieter international situation?
Well, it's very difficult to put myself in Putin's body and head, but if I would be him, probably I would pay more attention to internal affairs instead of international one. But all we know about Mr. Putin, saying that he's actually very fond of playing big international games, especially with the United States. And he's not too willing to pay too much attention to the internal affairs. And this is the area where he tries to put as much responsibility as possible to anyone else. But that said, the situation can actually demand his total attention. And yes, probably if the protests will grow wider and wider, he will be forced to attract more attention from the international affairs and from the US, and to make more direct and immediate responses for the demands of those people, of those on the streets and those protesting here inside Russia.
Mm-hmm. Well, I really want to thank both of our guests, Susan Glasser and Alexey Pivovarov. And fantastic discussion. I think it was subtle. It was very interesting and thought-provoking. And I hope you can come back for our next journalist boot camp. And thank you very much, Dr. Stent, for introducing us. And we'll be back soon with another chapter in our discussion about Russia.
Thank you so much, Jill. Have a great day. Thank you, Alexei.
Thank all of you. Thank you.